All right, so the first slide has what looks like very little information, but I actually have quite a few additional notes for each of the updates that you see on the screen. So the first one would be AB 104. A lot of students and parents are aware that AB 104 gave them the right to change letter grades to pass fail. And this happened, you should have been notified approximately 1 month ago. Although the deadline has passed, I do want to touch on what this means if you did change your grades and what this means for students who did not opt into changing their grades. So before this law even came out, the UCs had already said that pass-fail grades were admissible to satisfy A through G requirements. So that means that nothing really changed for them. Whether they have put pass-fail or if they've kept a B, a C, something that is still considered a passing grade, that's all going to be considered into the A through G eligibility, making sure that those students can still attend a UC. The big difference is if you got a C and you didn't change it to pass fail, that C is going to be part of your overall GPA calculation. One thing the UCs didn't elaborate upon in a lot of detail was how they're going to compare GPAs for students who did report grades versus those who have a lot of pass fail, overinflating their GPA, so to speak. So if they only show A's, for example, but they have A's out of 2 classes when they took 7, it seems like it would calculate to a 4.0, but I believe that they're still going to apply different weights to the GPAs that have more courses with actual grades versus those that don't. So if your student does have specific grades, they're not necessarily at a disadvantage. Most of the UC officers sort of concurred. They said that it would be helpful for course placement if they knew where a student was with an actual letter grade, and that if a student had a poor grade, they could explain it on the application. So our HS2 counselors, we're going to work with all of the students to help them report the grades as they're reflected on the transcript, regardless of whether or not they change them, and then write about any grade changes or any issues that might have occurred that required them to adjust something to pass fail or that resulted in a low grade during the online learning time. For the CAP GPA, it appears that the more AP classes you take, the lower the average GPA would be, even for straight A students. So we are going to talk a little bit more about GPAs and the different GPAs that UCs look at. But just a preview of that, they're looking at the capped GPA, they're looking at the uncapped weighted GPA, and they're looking at the unweighted GPA. So taking more AP courses is still beneficial to our students if they can have a higher uncapped weighted GPA overall. The exact number of APs is really going to depend on your student, what they're studying and what their capabilities are, because we also want to ensure that they're able to get the best grades possible rather than overloading them with a ton of AP courses and then getting subpar grades that could ultimately harm the GPA more than helping it. Another law that came out recently that's been in the news is this out-of-state admissions, limiting the number of students that can be from out of state at the UC system and at the Cal State system, so that more students in state are able to attend these state schools. Overall, they're looking at an 18% of students being able to be from out of state. And one thing they did clarify is that it's a gradual reduction. It's not that this next fall, it's immediately going to be capped at 18%. I believe UCLA said they're currently at about 22% out of state, and they're waiting for people to graduate out. The 18% limit is not for the number of applicants they can take in each year. It's the total number of out of state people they can have at their campus at any given time. Test blind policy is a big change that's obviously affected all of our students and parents and caused a lot of anxiety and questions. I have specific slides later that are going to go over what SAT and ACT being gone looks like in terms of the college admission review process, as well as some follow-up questions in terms of what they can see, what they can't see, what we need to report, whether or not ACT or SAT is ever useful on these applications. But just a general overview right now, the way that the test blind policy has changed other policies that you may be aware of or that you haven't learned about yet, but they will have changes that affect them. So one way you could satisfy your A through G requirements was admission by exam. So if a student, for any reason, didn't have enough English credits, for example, but they had a passing critical reading and writing score in SAT, that could supersede the fact that their GPA or their A through G wasn't satisfied, and they could still be admitted. The fact that admissions by exam is gone because there's no SAT score doesn't mean that student is necessarily ineligible. So admission by exam has been replaced entirely by admission by exception. So admission by exception usually requires a student to explain why they've not been able to fulfill an A through G requirement and ask the UCs to consider other bodies of work that would cover for that. The statewide eligibility says that the top 9% of students in the state are eligible to go to a UC. It doesn't guarantee a specific campus, but just any one of the UCs within the system. In the past, statewide eligibility was calculated, including the standardized test score. So now it's only based on GPA and the number of A through G eligible courses that the student takes. Thus, the more A through G eligible courses that someone is taking, the more points so much that they would have for their eligibility. Obviously, the higher the GPA, the more certain they are to get that guarantee. ELC is similar, but it's the local area, so it's just within their high school. The top 9% of graduates from high schools that participate in ELC, and quite a few of our HS2 high schools do participate, are going to also get acceptance into a UC. Now, if they only apply to UCLA and they don't get into UCLA, it's not a guarantee to the school they're applying for, it's a guarantee into the system. And so they would be offered admissions by a different UC, even if they did not apply. By default, the most common UC that everyone gets into through the eligibility indexes is UC Merced, because that one has the most available space. One of the questions we had is, what's a cap GPA? How is it different from the weighted or unweighted GPA? As I mentioned before, we are going to go more into the different types of GPAs in a little bit. And so I'll be able to answer that question when we look at how UCs consider all the different types of GPAs. Next thing that's mentioned is the predictable college clock, which actually just means a tuition, a flat rate tuition. So when your students enter freshman year at any UC, they're going to be told a tuition rate. In the past, these tuition rates have gone up every year that a student has been in attendance. Now, whatever rate they give you at the time that you matriculate is the same rate that you're going to see for all 4 years, actually all the way up to 6 years, depending on how long it takes you to graduate. So that's locked in for a maximum of 6 years. That doesn't mean the cost of college is going to be 100% the same throughout the entire 4 years. Cost of housing, cost of meals, cost of books, etc. That may rise as well, but the tuition would stay in place. Another thing that the overall system-wide update president mentioned was plagiarism. So in the past, they've always had a system in place. If a student's activities sound too good to be true, they're going to ask that student, hey, I need you to fill out this form. I need someone to verify that this had actually happened. One of my students had presidency for 6 of his school clubs, and he also raised $500,000 in scholarship money through one of those student organizations. In order for him to verify this for the form, he needed to give that to his principal, who wrote on his behalf stating, yes, this is indeed true. Yes, he did raise that money. And then we sent that into UC Berkeley, and he was ultimately accepted. So as long as the students are accurately reporting their accomplishments on their applications, there's no problem with the fact check system. The other thing that they've introduced this year, in order to make sure that students are accurately reporting things on their app, is a plagiarism tracker. So all essays are now being run through some sort of website or online system to verify that it's the student's original work. They said that last year alone, 650 applications were denied because the applicants were no longer eligible due to either application fact check errors or plagiarism. So they are taking this very seriously, and that's part of the reason at HS2 that we make sure that our students are crafting their own work, and we're helping them step by step so that they can avoid any consequences from either having false or invalid info on essays or in their activity lists. The final thing is more of a it's not really an update or a change, but for the math requirement, they did allow computer science to now count as a math course as well as data science. So the UCs recommend 3 years of mathematics. I'm sorry, require 3 years of mathematics. Requiring only 3 means that the 4th year is optional, but it's highly recommended. So the computer science and data science courses would fulfill that recommended 4th year. It doesn't fulfill the 3 main required years. The other thing is that geometry or math 2 is still going to remain a requirement for all the UCs. So even if your high school gives your student the option to place out or place out of math 2 and jump ahead, or to skip geometry, the UCs are going to need to see that on the transcript. All right, so here's information in general about the freshman applications. So as most of you know, this past year has been the most competitive for college applicants, whether they were applying to private schools or public schools. The UC system alone had an 18% increase in applications during this past season. The UC overall, although they had a big increase in applicants, the biggest jump was actually in out-of-state applicants. You can see that that's at 44%. So that means a 44% increase. However, the UC system reported that they had an all-time high number of admitted California freshmen. So they accepted over 84,000 students just from California. They also approximate that at least 40,000 of the incoming first-year students and 20,000 transfer students are going to be from California in fall 2021. They did vaguely mention that they're also working on other ways in which to continuously increase the number of California students, but that goes hand in hand with having to decrease the amount of out-of-state students. So there is a lot of talk about it being harder and harder for California applicants in order to get in. They are increasing the number of accepted California students, but it's very hard for that to outpace the number of applicants coming from our state, and especially because we have so many qualified applicants, especially within our demographic. So most UC campus presentations, they focused on an increase in a lot of these target groups that they're looking for. First generation, low income, minority student groups, so African American, Latina, Native American. But rest assured, the Asian student population are still the majority on most, if not all, of the UC campuses. And the percentage of Asian students at the UCs is still fairly stable. So this is still a viable option for most of our students. For example, at UC Berkeley, they posted a chart showing the ethnic breakdown of their population. Right now, for this current year, it's at 39% Asian or Asian American. Looking back about 5 years ago, it was at 40%. So we're still making up most of the campus, as well as having a very insignificant decrease in the amount of students that are being accepted. So our main issue is not that spots are being taken at the UCs by low-income first generation or other minorities. It's more about the fact that there's more and more qualified Asian students and international students from Asia and other Asian Americans who are applying every single year. And that increases the competition amongst all the students within our own demographic. So even though you see an increase in all of these other numbers, it's not necessarily a decrease in total amounts of Asian students being accepted. I really like data. So these are all the stats by the school. They gave me a ton of other stats as well as some links if anyone's very curious about getting more information on the statistics behind these schools. I can share links with you in the Q&A or in the chat towards the end. But this is just a brief overview. All of them stressed how many applications they got this year, the major jump in applications. And so that resulted in a lower acceptance rate for every school except UC Riverside and UC Merced. The numbers prove, I mean, the stories don't always match what's actually happening. So anecdotally, a lot of people have said, oh, UCI is getting harder and harder every year. You can see acceptance rate this year, 29% versus fall of last year, which was 29.9%. So it's not necessarily a huge discrepancy. Again, the issue is more that UCI has an increase in applicants. And so that unchanged rate in acceptance means that UCI is accepting more students, but there's still more applicants who are also being denied admissions. And so that's why it may feel that it's more difficult to achieve acceptance into the school. They're also getting more particular, and a lot of the mid-tier UCs, San Diego, Irvine, Santa Barbara, and Davis, are looking to maximize their yield. So they're looking at a range of students in a very specific niche. They don't want students that are too qualified, and you hear it all the time. Oh, so-and-so's friend got into Harvard, but they didn't get into UC Irvine. But they're also looking at students that are too low on the spectrum in terms of GPA or activities, and they're not accepting them either. So it's a very small window, and they're continuing to narrow that to make sure that they're getting students accepted that are ultimately more likely to accept their offer of admissions. And that's part of the reason when we work on our HS2 college list with students, we match them. We look at where's your target, where's your far reach, your likely, your dreams, and we try to pair them up with the appropriate level UCs to make sure that they're applying to schools where they have the best hopes for getting admitted. And also for us, you know, we want to make sure that they hopefully attend as well. UC Berkeley has a higher acceptance rate and more total admits than UCLA. So I wanted to point that out, but they're still similar in difficulty in terms of acceptances. So I know the rates are several percentage points off, but if you think about it this way, out of 100 applicants to Berkeley, 85 students are rejected. And at UCLA, out of 100 applicants, 89 students are rejected. So it's still extremely competitive at both. We don't necessarily have a greater advantage at Berkeley simply because the acceptance rate is slightly higher. It's still going to be a dream or far reach school for most of our students. So before I go into what the admissions readers are doing with the lack of standardized tests without the SAT and ACT, I wanted to kind of review what the criteria looks like. So all of the UCs have 13 points that they take into consideration. Each college has their own system in terms of how important each of these points are and how they interpret that for their application review. Some, like UCR, have a very straight numeric value assigned to each of these criteria, and then they multiply that out to determine which students are best suited for admissions. Others are a little bit more flexible with their holistic policies, and so they're looking at the student overall, but keeping in mind these 13 admission criteria. So the 5 on this page are all based on GPA. You can see academic grade point average in A through G, number of academic courses beyond A through G, performance in their honors courses, which include AP and IB and college courses, that local area and statewide context, so being top 9%, so essentially being one of the best in your school as well as one of the best in the state, and then what classes you're taking your senior year, those that are in progress or planned. So if anyone has students that are hoping that senior year they can sit back and relax, they should be aware that both public and private schools still require you to list your senior year classes. So you can't take ceramics and drama and art and one English class. The colleges will expect you to continue with the same level of academic rigor that you've had throughout high school well into your senior year. Moving on, the next would be academic performance relative to the educational opportunities available in your school. So this is going to be more like a measurement of rigor. If your school offers 15 AP courses and you took 2, compared to somebody whose school offered 3 courses and you took 2, it's not really showing that you put yourself out there to take advantage of all the higher level coursework that was offered to you. And then of course, we have a lot of our HS2 students take additional AP exams or AP classes, college level courses. So not only the educational opportunities at your high school, but how did you work beyond that and exceed the limitations of high school and go into more advanced coursework? Which lends itself to number 7, which is outstanding performance in one or more specific subject areas. And that oftentimes is going to be tied to the major. So if you are majoring in engineering, for example, they're going to want to see outstanding performance in science and mathematics, more so than the humanities. Number 8 is also similar to major. So special projects are typically going to be things that evidence the student's curiosity, intellectual interest, as well as their talents and skills in a specific area. So again, let's refer to that engineering major. If that student has gone on to publish their own research paper and presented that finding in academic journals, as well as at professional conferences, that's going to show some pretty outstanding work in the field that they ultimately are saying they want to go into. Number 9 is once again GPA. So we're shifting back from the activities again to the quality of your academics. And they're saying an improvement. So 9th grade doesn't count in the UC GPA, whether it is capped or uncapped, their 9th grade is never calculated into it. But it gives them context. If a student has a B or 2 Bs in 9th grade, although it doesn't hurt the GPA, it makes them look even better if in 10th and 11th grade, they now have straight A's. Because it's showing that they really learned how to handle school better, apply themselves, and ultimately reflect that with a higher overall GPA. If a student were to get a poor grade first semester, but then do well second semester, same thing. It's showing that they've put forth the work and tried to find ways to sort of compensate for whatever was holding them back from getting an A to begin with. Number 10 is special talents, achievements, and awards. Once again, they're mentioning in a particular field. So your student doesn't need to have 17 different activities and have achievements in all 17 of them at a super high level. They want to see that you've really, again, zeroed in on something in particular. Most of the time it's your major. It can also be a supplemental field if you have outstanding talents in the arts, in music, film, etc. If that's going to be more of a minor or a hobby that you're pursuing, but that you've pursued at a very high level, they'd like to see that. And then rounding it out, completion of special projects within the context, again, of your high school. So special projects in general, if you're doing things in the community or if you're doing things with professors, but also what you've done within your school, considering what's available. Number 12, academic accomplishments in light of your life experiences and any special circumstances. So when we mentioned admissions and how they highlighted specific ethnic groups, low income, first generation, that's what they're talking about in the life experience section. And then 13 is the location of your secondary school and residence. That comes down to the fact that they can't have 90% of their population coming from 10 different secondary schools. They need to have geographic and school diversity as well. That way students, when they're experiencing college, they're not really doing high school 2.0, they're mixing with a large group of people. And that's why we always tell our students, your first line of competition is the students around you. The people within your high school are the people that are competing for your spot directly. And then of course it goes on to compare you to the people within your region, within your state. But the people at your high school, UC Berkeley can only accept so many students from the same high school. So they're not going to take 100 qualified applicants from the same secondary school, even though 100 people meet the criteria. As you can see, the majority of the criteria, with the exception of 12 and 13, they're all focused on GPA and activities. The last 2 items are really beyond the student's control. But what we do with our counseling students is ask them these questions. What are your family situation? Are you a single parent household? Did you have low income? Has anyone been affected by COVID, job displacement, anything that could help them show that they've had something in their life that is different or more unique than those around them? We also utilize this information for their personal insight questions and additional info on the applications, just to give them a little bit more understanding and background of our students and where they're coming from. Okay, back into numbers, or testing anyway. They did a presentation called A Year Without an SAT or ACT, and this is a slide directly from that presentation showing us what changed in the way that they reviewed applications. So we can all reasonably assume that one of the biggest causes for the increase in applicants was taking away the ACT and SAT score consideration. I mean, the UCs will say, oh, we were able to reach more students because we did everything online. But ultimately, I think a lot of students felt a barrier with that test score. And without it, more people were comfortable. I think that's also why we saw such a drastic rise in the out-of-state applicants as well. Although all UCs utilize this 13-factor review process, the 13 facts we just went over, these are the overall trends in how the admissions raters adjusted to applications without test scores. Basically, I mean, it's all summed up when you look at what they're looking at more deeply. It's GPA. It stayed as important as ever, if not become slightly more important than it was in the past. GPA is always the #1 consideration when looking at applicants. And then extracurriculars. That's what got more or less in place of the SAT score. Without the testing component for SAT and ACT, a lot of people thought the APs are now more important. But that's not the way they're viewing it. In fact, the resume, where your student has spent their time and what accomplishments they've made, that's what now becomes much more important to the readers. The UCs were also nice enough to give us a little preview of what they want to do in the future for standardized testing. There was a rumor that I believe the UCs actually started when they eliminated the test requirement, stating that they were going to come up with their own test. I attended multiple seminars, and in all of them, they adamantly stuck to the fact that they are not going to make their own test. If anything, one representative did mention the SBAC, the Smarter Balance Assessment that's already given out at our schools, and looking at that to see if it could potentially be not necessarily a replacement, but using those scores as an indicator of a student's abilities or aptitude. As of right now, though, the SBAC is optional as well, even at the high school level, and parents and students can opt out of it. So that's more of a long-term potential idea, but it's definitely not anything that they would implement anytime soon. In fact, they've already all committed to being completely test blind, at least through the fall 2024 application cycle. They did say that if you choose to submit your scores, they could be used to meet minimum subject requirements or for placement tests or placement purposes. So let's say a student took AP Lang and they got a 2. That score is not high enough to place them out of the freshman writing requirement. However, if they have an SAT or an ACT score that qualifies for them, then they could still skip out of that course. The only courses that apply to SAT and ACT would be math and English. So you cannot place into a higher level science course, foreign language, etc., based on the SAT or ACT. If your student has AP scores that will already meet the placement purpose or minimum subject requirements, they definitely do not need to report an SAT or ACT. We are still encouraging students to prepare for SAT and ACT, but not for the UCs. It's specifically going to be helpful for private colleges, even those that have test optional policies. Since this comes up a lot in counseling meetings and it came up at the UC conference, I'm dedicating a few slides to talking about the majors because there's a whole lot of, I guess, mythology around what kinds of majors or what majors or how majors work. So I wanted to just lay out in these charts, it's pretty simple explanations of exactly how the UCs are looking at majors when they're evaluating admissions. So any school on this list that says that major choice is a factor in admissions for that particular college within the university, that means it's more selective for those colleges as a whole. So any type of engineering major you choose in the College of Engineering at Berkeley is going to be more selective than choosing a major that is not in the College of Engineering or not in the College of Chemistry. It means that when you apply with these majors, they're going to be zeroing in on very specific things. Once again, that GPA, so the grades that relate to that major, engineering, math, science, physics, etc. And also your activities and awards within that same context. So what engineering related activities or STEM-based endeavors you've done. Any college that says that all the majors receive the same review process, they don't mean that every major is equally likely to help a student get in. They want to see students who are choosing majors outside of the main 10. And I'll actually show you a list of what they self-reported as their most popular majors across the UC systems. They want you to look at things that are more niche, more set to what your particular goals are or your activities. Most of these colleges offer over 100 majors. So as a college counselor, I'm usually working with my students trying to identify things that are going to help them stand out, as opposed to just applying to College of Engineering because that's what the majority of other students are doing. Finally, if a major is a factor for admission, that indicates that it's harder for a student to transfer into this college or major at a later date. For instance, they shouldn't try to apply with a less popular major and then try to switch into engineering at Berkeley or UCLA. There's going to be barriers to entry. According to one of the UCLA reps, switching majors from one of our schools, engineering, film, art, music, nursing, within that college is a relatively easy process. Switching from the college to one of those other schools is not guaranteed by any stretch. Students would have to apply, submit a portfolio, complete major prep, and more. Is it possible to switch into one of the schools? Yes, but students shouldn't count on that as being likely. So a long way of saying it's probably not going to happen. And so if your students would only consider going to UCLA if they let them in as engineering, then they should still apply as engineering. They shouldn't apply as something else and then hope that they can transfer over. I think we have a couple questions about majors. The difference between computer science, Bachelor of Art, and Bachelor of Science. So in general, a Bachelor of Art is going to have, and Bachelor of Science are going to have two different sets of coursework. The initial coursework is going to overlap, and then the Bachelor of Arts is going to be a more humanities-based approach to it, whereas the Bachelor of Science is going to be the more scientific approach to it. So it's more about which classes you need to take in order to have that designation. Is SAT more popular than ACT? The last time I checked the stats on that, ACT had a slightly higher, I believe it was 51% to 49% for the SAT. But that number might have fluctuated since the last time I saw it. So on the UC application, all the schools except Berkeley allow students to choose a second choice major. So I wanted to, again, clarify a little bit on how the schools utilize that second choice. If a student chooses a major within one of the competitive colleges, like engineering, then they need to choose an alternative major that's outside of the engineering school, with the exception of UCLA. That's the only one that doesn't guarantee they will look at an applicant's second choice major. The representative from UCLA said students can list an alternate major for engineering in the same school of engineering. However, if they're not admitted to an engineering major, we will not consider them for an alternate outside of the College of Engineering. So they're not going to look at them for letters and sciences if their first choice is engineering. If a student were to actually swap that and put engineering as their second choice, they would be evaluated for their first choice, but they probably wouldn't get into engineering as their second choice. So it has to be their primary, again, if that's the only way that they're going to go to that college. If they are in the least bit uncertain and want to overall boost their chances of getting in, they would apply with an alternative major. And then as you can see, most of the schools on this list do consider applicants for both majors. So all of them except Berkeley and LA for engineering are going to look at first the first choice, and if they don't feel that the student is a good match for that program, are going to consider them for the second one. And so that's why part of our admission strategy is to come up with one competitive major that maybe matches what the student ultimately wants to do, and one slightly less competitive major that's going to also put them on the same career track. Which goes straight into my next slide, which is the most competitive majors at the UCs. And you can see there's a lot of overlap with this. And the majors that are being, I'm sorry, the other slide where I said the importance of major selection. So not surprising, engineering, comp sci, those are the most competitive majors at most of the UCs. Any of them that offer business, and there's not that many that have direct entry to business and direct entry to nursing, those are also impacted as well. So that's why it's important for students to have an alternate and not really fall into these typical major categories. For example, studying human development or even biochemistry instead of just pure bio at UC San Diego makes it easier to get in, and a student would still pursue a same pre-med pathway, which is just a set of courses they take in order to prepare for medical school. So a lot of times it comes down to, do I want this school or do I want this major? And if they really want to up their chances for these top schools within the UC system, they're going to need to be more flexible about the majors that they choose. And this is just a quick list of the most popular majors at UCs. I think we attended presentations from all of them. And so across the board, these were the ones that were identified. Most likely your student has already considered these majors and hasn't really thought of anything beyond this list. And so that's something that we'd like to do within counseling, is sort of expose them to some additional options, help them develop portfolios for those, and ultimately have a better chance at being accepted into one of these schools. They did release some new majors, which is funny that a lot of them do coincide with the ones that are most popular. So it's not necessarily true that these majors are going to be easier for students to get in, but they do have diversified options. Being its first year for a lot of these majors, that could make them slightly less known, and so students may have an advantage applying to them this year. The UCs are also really adapting to what people need. So as you can see, a lot of them have added a data science program. UCSB has statistics and data science, and they also did an actuarial science as well. So if students were having difficulties finding majors related to business or computer science or certain types of engineering at a lot of these UCs, that's going to be less of a problem in moving forward as they continue to add more. One thing I noted during the seminar is that they're also having more accelerated or collapsed programs. So UCR, for example, is doing a 5-year master in statistics program. And then UCSC is doing a 5-year master's program in earth science. And they also mentioned that they have 21 accelerated 3-year programs. So that means that students who come in with quite a few AP credits or community college credits can actually get through one, sometimes even a major and a minor, but at least one major and graduate within 3 years. So the UCs in that way are becoming more cost effective, and also giving your students the opportunity to do a 5-year program versus having to do a separate application and a separate school for their master's. So I think that that's a nice way that they're sort of responding to what more private schools have offered traditionally to be more competitive. Okay, so the rest of this is actually going to be information directly from the Q&A sessions. Out of all of the slideshows and presentations and graphs, I thought the Q&A was actually the most helpful because, once again, I